"Take my revenge and I will be your wife forever," said the Apache woman to the cowboy. In the late 1800s, the American frontier was a land of wild beauty and danger. Vast deserts stretched for miles, broken only by rugged mountains and narrow, winding rivers. It was a place where life was hard, and survival was never guaranteed. Towns were small, dusty clusters of wooden buildings, each with its own saloon, general store, and a handful of homes. Cowboys rode from ranch to ranch, and the Apache people lived in the land they had called home for generations. It was a time when tensions between settlers and the Apache tribes were high, and every choice could have serious consequences. Clara was born into this world. She was a young Apache woman with eyes as sharp as the hawk that circled above the desert cliffs. Her family had lived on this land for as long as she could remember, learning the ways of the land from her mother and father. They knew how to track animals, find water in the dry desert, and move silently through the brush when danger came near. Clara had inherited all of these skills, but she had also inherited a quiet strength that set her apart from many others. She was smart, resourceful, and determined, even at a young age. Life had not been easy for Clara. Her childhood had been marked by small tragedies and constant reminders that the world could be cruel. One day, a group of men, outsiders who cared little for the Apache people, had come to her village. They were looking for trouble, for land, and for power. In the chaos that followed, Clara lost members of her family. That day changed her forever. She watched people she loved disappear, and she realized that the world was not fair. From that moment on, she vowed she would never be powerless again. She would protect her people, her land, and herself, no matter what the cost. Despite the dangers around her, Clara grew into a skilled and confident young woman. She learned how to move quietly through the desert, how to find food and water when others might starve, and how to defend herself if she needed to. She was proud of her heritage and of everything her family had taught her. Yet, even with all her skills, Clara knew she could not face the world alone. She understood that life required both courage and careful thinking. One wrong step, and everything she cared about could be lost. Meanwhile, in a nearby town, there was a young cowboy named Ethan. He was a man shaped by the harsh frontier, with calloused hands, sun-browned skin, and a restless spirit. Ethan had grown up learning how to ride horses, herd cattle, and live off the land. He was known for his bravery, but also for being impulsive at times. He often acted before he thought, which sometimes led him into dangerous situations. But he had a good heart and a sense of fairness that guided him, even when the world around him seemed unfair. Ethan's life was very different from Clara's, but their paths were about to cross in a way that neither of them could have imagined. One day, while Ethan was riding through the outskirts of the Apache lands, he stumbled upon signs of trouble. There had been a skirmish, and someone had left behind tracks that told a story of fear and struggle. Ethan followed the trail, curious and concerned, not realizing that his actions would bring him face to face with Clara and the events that had changed her life so dramatically. Clara had been tracking the same group of men who had caused her family so much pain. She moved quietly, her footsteps barely leaving marks in the sand. She had been watching, waiting, planning. She knew that one mistake could cost her everything. When she saw Ethan, she was wary. He was a stranger, dressed like the other settlers, and she could not tell if he was a friend or a threat. Yet there was something in the way he moved, careful, alert, respectful of the land, that made her pause. Their first meeting was tense. Clara confronted Ethan, demanding to know why he was there and what his intentions were. Ethan, surprised and unarmed for a fight, tried to explain that he meant no harm. He spoke calmly, showing respect for her people and her land. Clara listened, her eyes never leaving his face, searching for any sign of dishonesty. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the wind blowing across the desert. Both understood that trust could not be given lightly, and yet somehow they felt a spark of understanding. Over the next few days, Clara observed Ethan from a distance. She noticed his bravery when he helped a wounded traveler, his fairness when he resolved a small dispute in the town, and his willingness to learn about the Apache way of life. Slowly, she began to see that not all outsiders were like the men who had harmed her family. Ethan was different. He had the courage to face danger, but also the wisdom to know when to act carefully. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt a small hope that perhaps she could trust someone outside her tribe. Still, Clara's anger and desire for justice did not fade. She could not forget what had happened to her family, and she could not allow the men responsible to escape punishment. She had spent years planning, watching, and preparing. The fire of revenge burned inside her, guiding her decisions and her movements. And now, with Ethan nearby, she realized that perhaps she did not have to face this journey alone. Perhaps, with careful planning and the right ally, she could finally confront those who had caused her so much pain. Ethan, for his part, was intrigued by Clara. He had met many people in his life, but few had the strength and determination he saw in her. He admired her skills, her intelligence, and her unwavering resolve. He sensed that she carried a deep pain, but also a powerful sense of justice. He felt drawn to her, not just as a companion in the challenges they faced, but as someone who had lived through hardship and come out stronger. Ethan knew that if he could earn her trust, he might find more than friendship. He might find a bond that could change both of their lives forever. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Clara and Ethan stood on opposite sides of a dry riverbed, each aware of the path ahead. Danger was everywhere, and the men they were tracking were ruthless and clever. But for the first time, Clara felt a sense of cautious hope. She realized that perhaps with Ethan by her side, she could face the challenges ahead and finally seek the justice she longed for. And Ethan knew that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined, for the desert was full of secrets, and one of them was the extraordinary woman who now stood across from him. That night, as the stars appeared above the desert, both Clara and Ethan lay awake in their separate camps, thinking about the journey ahead. They did not yet know that their paths were about to become deeply entwined, that their fates were linked by both danger and destiny. One thing was certain. The story of Clara, the Apache woman with a heart full of fire, and Ethan, the cowboy with a restless spirit, was only just beginning. And when it did unfold, it would be a story of courage, trust, and a quest for justice that would leave no heart unchanged. After that first tense encounter, Clara and Ethan began to move cautiously through the desert together. Both of them knew the stakes were high. Clara could not forgive easily, and Ethan had learned that life on the frontier was full of hidden dangers. They had a common goal now. The men who had caused so much pain to Clara and her people had to be stopped. Yet the journey toward that goal was filled with risk, uncertainty, and moments that would test their courage and resolve. Clara kept a careful watch on Ethan as they traveled. She noticed small things about him that told her more than words ever could. The way he adjusted his saddle, checking the straps carefully, showed his attention to detail. The way he looked at the land, scanning for movement or unusual patterns, revealed his awareness. Even the calm tone in his voice when he gave directions or asked questions suggested he had experience and thoughtfulness. Slowly, Clara began to believe that Ethan might be someone she could trust, though she remained cautious. Ethan, meanwhile, was fascinated by Clara's knowledge and skills. She seemed to understand the desert in a way that went beyond mere survival. She knew which plants could be eaten and which could heal wounds. She knew how to find water in places where it seemed impossible. She knew how to read the tracks of animals and people alike. Ethan realized that traveling with Clara was not only safer, it was a lesson in itself. He began to admire her more each day, seeing not just her strength, but also her intelligence and determination. Their days were filled with careful planning. Clara would study the movements of the men they were tracking, noting where they went and how they behaved. Ethan would scout ahead, looking for potential obstacles or dangers that could slow them down. They often traveled long distances under the scorching sun, sometimes resting only at night, when the desert became cooler and the stars shone bright above them. During these quiet nights, they shared stories of their pasts, though carefully and in small pieces. Clara spoke of her family, of the life she had known before tragedy struck. Ethan told of his childhood on a small ranch and the lessons he had learned from his parents and neighbors. Despite the growing connection between them, tension remained. Clara's heart was heavy with the desire for revenge. She could not forget the pain of losing her family, and the thought of the men who had caused it burned within her. Ethan could see the anger in her eyes, but he also saw the wisdom behind it. He realized that revenge was not a simple thing. It required careful planning and careful action. He offered advice when he could, suggesting ways to avoid unnecessary danger while still pursuing justice. Clara listened, sometimes reluctantly, but she began to see the value in his guidance. The journey was not easy. The desert tested them at every turn. One day, a sudden sandstorm forced them to take shelter behind a rocky outcrop. The wind blew so fiercely that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Clara and Ethan huddled together, sharing the small space, and waited for the storm to pass. During that time, they spoke little, relying instead on the shared experience of surviving another danger together. It was moments like these that built a quiet bond between them, a sense of understanding that went beyond words. As they moved closer to the men they sought, Clara began to study their patterns more carefully. She noticed small details that others might have missed. The way they left broken branches behind, the way their horses moved, the times of day they traveled. Each clue brought them closer to understanding the men's movements, but it also reminded Clara of how careful she had to be. One mistake could mean the end of their plan, or worse, the loss of life. She shared her observations with Ethan, and together they began to formulate a plan, one that required patience, precision, and trust in one another. Ethan began to see a different side of Clara during this time. While she was fierce and determined, he also saw her moments of vulnerability. When she thought no one was watching, her eyes would cloud with memory, with sorrow for what she had lost. But even then, she did not falter. She pressed on, determined to see justice done. Ethan admired this about her. He realized that strength was not just in skill or courage, but also in the ability to face pain and continue moving forward. He felt himself growing more protective of her, not because she needed protection, but because he wanted to stand by her side in whatever came next. There were also moments of humor and lightness, small breaks from the tension. One evening, while setting up camp, Ethan accidentally tripped over a fallen branch, sending his hat flying across the sand. Clara laughed quietly, though she tried to hide it, and Ethan smiled, rubbing his head. For a few minutes, the weight of their journey lifted, and they were simply two people sharing a moment in the vast desert. These moments were precious, for they reminded both Clara and Ethan that even in difficult times, there was room for connection, for trust, and for hope. As the days went by, the dangers became more real. The men they were tracking were clever and ruthless, and they left traps and misleading signs behind. Clara and Ethan had to stay alert at all times, watching for movement, listening for unusual sounds, and preparing for sudden confrontations. Their bond strengthened as they relied on each other for safety and support. Every decision had to be careful and calculated. Mistakes were not easily forgiven in this land, and both Clara and Ethan knew that a single error could change everything. One day, as the sun rose over a distant canyon, Clara spotted fresh tracks leading toward a small abandoned settlement. She signaled Ethan to follow quietly. They moved slowly, crouched low to the ground, their senses alert. The tracks belonged to the men they had been tracking for weeks. Clara felt a surge of determination. Finally, they were close, but she also felt a pang of uncertainty. They had prepared for this moment, but the reality of facing these men was different from planning. The weight of what could happen pressed on her, and she had to remind herself to stay focused. Ethan noticed the change in Clara's demeanor. He did not speak, but he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She glanced at him, and in that small gesture she saw understanding and support. It was a moment of quiet strength, a reminder that even in the most dangerous times they were not alone. Together they approached the settlement, careful and deliberate, each step bringing them closer to the confrontation that would test their courage, skill, and resolve. As they neared the settlement, Clara shared with Ethan the plan she had in mind. It was not a plan of mindless revenge, but a careful strategy to hold the men accountable for their actions. She wanted justice, not unnecessary bloodshed, and she trusted Ethan to help her see it through. They would need to be clever, patient, and prepared for anything. Ethan nodded, understanding the balance between caution and courage. He knew that this moment would define much of their journey, but he also knew that together they had a chance to succeed. The night before they intended to confront the men, they camped near the edge of a dry creek. The desert was quiet, and the stars stretched endlessly above them. They spoke softly about the past and what they hoped for the future. Clara expressed her fears, her doubts, and her longing for justice. Ethan listened, offering encouragement and understanding. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe that she might not have to face her challenges alone. And Ethan, looking at her, realized that their journey had become more than a mission. It had become a partnership built on respect, trust, and a growing bond that neither of them had expected. As the fire crackled between them, casting warm light on their faces, both knew that the coming days would be difficult. The men they faced were dangerous, and the risk of failure was real. Yet, for the first time in a long while, Clara felt a sense of hope. She had Ethan by her side, and together they had the skills, courage, and determination to face whatever lay ahead. The bond between them had grown strong, forged in the harsh desert and the shared goal of justice. And so, as the desert night wrapped them in silence, Clara and Ethan rested, knowing that the next day would bring challenges unlike any they had faced before. They had prepared, planned, and trusted each other, but the true test was about to begin. The men they sought were clever and ruthless, but Clara and Ethan had something stronger: determination, skill, and a partnership that neither danger nor fear could break. The journey of trust, courage, and the quest for justice continued, and both knew that what lay ahead would change their lives forever. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, casting long shadows across the dry, rocky land. Clara and Ethan were already awake, preparing for the day ahead. Their plan had been carefully thought out, but the reality of what they were about to face pressed heavily on both of them. This was not just a test of skill or courage, it was a test of patience, trust, and the ability to act under pressure. Clara felt her heart beat faster than usual. She knew that today everything could change. As they approached the small settlement where the men were staying, Clara signaled to Ethan to move quietly. Every step they took was deliberate, measured, and careful. The desert was quiet except for the occasional rustle of dry leaves and the soft whistle of the wind. Each sound made them pause, listening for signs of movement. The men they were tracking were known for being clever, and Clara had learned not to underestimate them. They might be armed, dangerous, and ready for anything. Clara crouched behind a low rock, pointing out the positions of the men in the settlement. She had studied the area for days, memorizing every detail. She whispered her plan to Ethan, explaining how they could approach without being noticed, how they could isolate the men responsible for the past wrongs, and how they could make sure no innocent person would be harmed. Ethan nodded, his face serious but calm. He trusted Clara's judgment, and he knew that her plan had a better chance of success than anything he could have imagined. They moved closer, staying low and careful. Every step was tense, every sound amplified in their ears. Clara's mind raced with memories of her family and the pain that had brought her here. She could feel her anger rising, but she forced herself to stay focused. Revenge was not just about acting on emotion, it required planning, timing, and precision. Ethan stayed close, following her lead and ready to act at a moment's notice. Together they were a team, relying on each other's strengths to face the danger ahead. Suddenly, a dog barked from within the settlement. Both Clara and Ethan froze, hearts pounding. For a moment, it seemed that their presence had been discovered, but then the sound faded, and they realized the dog had simply barked at a passing bird. Clara exhaled slowly, trying to calm the tension in her chest. She glanced at Ethan, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. They could not allow fear or surprise to shake them now. The plan had to be executed exactly as they had discussed. As they approached the edge of the settlement, Clara spotted the first of the men they had been tracking. He was leaning against a wooden post, whistling softly, unaware of their presence. Clara signaled to Ethan to take position, and they moved silently, hiding behind the shadows of abandoned buildings. Her heart beat faster, but her hands were steady. Every step, every breath was part of the delicate balance between success and failure. She reminded herself that this was not just about revenge. It was about justice, about holding those responsible accountable for their actions. The men in the settlement were rough and careless, thinking that the desert was theirs to control. They had grown overconfident after years of taking what they wanted without consequence. Clara knew that their arrogance would be their weakness. She whispered to Ethan, explaining how they could use this to their advantage. The plan was simple in theory but required perfect timing. Isolate the leaders, prevent them from escaping, and make sure no one else was hurt. Ethan listened carefully, understanding the seriousness of the moment. Just as they were about to move into position, one of the men turned unexpectedly. Clara's breath caught in her throat, but she remained calm. Ethan stayed close, ready to act if needed. The man glanced around, sensing something was unusual, but then he shrugged and returned to his conversation with the others. Clara exhaled quietly, feeling a surge of relief. They were close, but the danger was real. One wrong move could ruin everything. Clara and Ethan continued to advance, moving from shadow to shadow, using every building and rock for cover. The settlement was a maze of narrow paths, old wooden fences, and abandoned wagons. Clara's knowledge of the land and her sharp instincts guided them. She noticed small details that others might overlook. A loose board that could creak under weight, footprints that revealed the movements of the men, and the direction of the wind that could carry their scent. Ethan followed closely, trusting her lead and preparing himself for whatever confrontation might come. As they approached the central building where the men were gathered, Clara whispered the final instructions to Ethan. This was the moment where everything depended on their courage, patience, and coordination. They would need to act swiftly but carefully, striking only when the opportunity was right. Clara's mind was sharp, every plan she had made over the past weeks coming together in this one critical moment. She felt the familiar fire of determination burning inside her, driving her forward even as fear and doubt threatened to creep in. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the settlement. A wagon wheel had broken nearby. Clara and Ethan froze, hearts racing. The men inside the building looked toward the sound, suspicion on their faces. Clara's eyes scanned the area, looking for a way to continue without being discovered. She noticed a narrow alley between two buildings and signaled to Ethan to follow her. They slipped into the alley, staying low and silent, moving closer to their target. The closer they got, the more intense the tension became. Clara's thoughts raced with memories of the past, the loss of her family, the struggles of her people, and the pain that had brought her to this moment. She reminded herself that revenge was not just about anger, it was about justice and doing what was right. Ethan, sensing her inner conflict, stayed close and offered silent support. Together they were a force, united by purpose and growing trust. As they approached the building, they noticed that one of the men had stepped outside, unaware of their presence. Clara saw an opportunity. She signaled to Ethan, and they moved quickly but carefully, positioning themselves to confront him first. The man looked around, confused, as Clara stepped into view. Her voice was calm but firm. "We need to talk," she said, her eyes locked on his. The man laughed, thinking she was a lone woman who could not threaten him. He was wrong. Clara's confidence, skill, and determination were clear. Ethan stepped forward, reinforcing her presence and showing that they were prepared for anything. The man's arrogance began to fade, replaced by caution and fear. Clara spoke of the past, of the pain caused by his actions, and of the justice that was now coming. Ethan watched, ready to act if needed, but trusting Clara to lead the confrontation. The tension was high, but Clara remained composed. She used her knowledge and careful planning to guide the situation, making sure that no innocent person would be harmed. The man realized that he could not escape, that the time for reckoning had come. Clara's calm strength, combined with Ethan's support, created a powerful presence that forced him to listen. Slowly, he began to understand that the consequences of his actions had finally arrived. The situation reached a critical point when another man from the settlement appeared unexpectedly. Clara and Ethan had to think quickly. They moved together, using the shadows and the terrain to their advantage. The second man realized too late that he was surrounded. Clara's strategy, combined with Ethan's quick thinking, allowed them to prevent any violence while ensuring that the men could not escape. It was a tense, careful dance of skill, timing, and courage, and for a moment everything hung in the balance. By the end of the confrontation, the men were cornered and aware that their past actions had consequences. Clara spoke with authority and clarity, explaining the pain they had caused and the justice that was necessary. Ethan supported her, showing that they were united and prepared to ensure fairness. It was a moment of triumph for Clara, but also a moment of reflection. She realized that revenge was not just about anger. It was about accountability, courage, and the ability to act wisely under pressure. As the sun began to set over the desert, Clara and Ethan stood together, looking at the men who had caused so much pain. The confrontation had been intense, but they had succeeded without unnecessary violence. Clara felt a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and the lingering weight of the past. She turned to Ethan, who offered a reassuring smile. They had faced the crisis together, and their partnership had proven strong. That night, as they camped outside the settlement, Clara thought about everything that had led to this moment: the loss, the anger, the planning, and the courage it had taken to face her enemies. Ethan sat quietly beside her, respecting the silence and the gravity of the day. They had come through the breaking point, but both knew that challenges still lay ahead. The journey was not over, and the lessons of patience, trust, and courage would continue to guide them. The desert around them was quiet, yet alive with the knowledge that life on the frontier was never simple or predictable. Clara and Ethan had survived the most dangerous part of their journey so far, but the real test of their strength, wisdom, and partnership was only beginning. They had learned that courage alone was not enough. Careful planning, patience, and trust in each other were just as important. And as they rested under the stars, both understood that the bond they had formed in the heat of crisis was unbreakable, preparing them for the challenges still to come. The desert morning was calm, with a soft breeze moving across the dry land. Clara and Ethan had survived the confrontation at the settlement, and the danger of the men who had caused so much pain was no longer immediate. But both of them knew that their journey was far from over. The desert had a way of hiding new challenges, and the lessons they had learned during the crisis would soon be tested in new ways. Clara felt a quiet determination rising inside her. She had faced the most dangerous moment so far, but now it was time to take the next step, not just for revenge, but for justice, protection, and the future. Clara and Ethan moved carefully, leaving the settlement behind as the sun climbed higher. The desert stretched endlessly before them, and they knew that their journey would take them through rough terrain, unpredictable weather, and the constant risk of running into other dangers. Yet they moved with confidence now. Their partnership had grown stronger during the confrontation. Clara had learned to trust Ethan's judgment, and Ethan had seen firsthand Clara's strength, skill, and intelligence. Together, they were no longer just two people surviving the desert. They were a team capable of facing whatever came next. As they traveled, Clara began to reflect on what had happened at the settlement. She realized that revenge alone was not enough. Holding the men accountable had been important, but the true measure of justice required more than confrontation. It required understanding, strategy, and protection for those who could not defend themselves. She turned to Ethan and shared her thoughts. "We can't stop here," she said quietly. "There are others who could be hurt if we don't act carefully. We have to think ahead." Ethan nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words. He had always known Clara was smart, but her insight into the bigger picture now impressed him more than ever. Their plan began to take shape. Clara and Ethan would need to warn other settlers, ensure the safety of nearby villages, and create a system where the men who had caused harm could not return to the land. It was a challenge that required careful coordination, patience, and courage. They decided to split their time between scouting, observing, and taking action when necessary. It was no longer just about a single confrontation. It was about long-term safety, justice, and responsibility. As they moved, Clara noticed subtle signs of life in the desert. Tracks of animals, small patches of water, and areas where plants were thriving despite the harsh conditions. She used these signs to guide their path, making sure they remained safe while staying on course. Ethan learned quickly, following her lead and asking questions to understand more about the land and the people who lived there. Their days were filled with constant observation, careful movement, and quiet conversation. Through this, they grew closer, learning about each other's fears, hopes, and the experiences that had shaped them. One afternoon, as the sun beat down on the desert, Clara and Ethan came across a small group of settlers who had been unaware of the dangers around them. Their homes were simple, and they lived off the land, trusting that the desert would provide. But Clara could see the worry in their eyes and the fear that danger might return. She approached them carefully, speaking in a calm, friendly voice. She explained the situation and offered guidance on how to protect themselves and their families. Ethan helped by demonstrating safe practices for traveling and defending their homes. The settlers were grateful, and for Clara, helping others in this way gave her a sense of purpose beyond revenge. That evening, they camped near a narrow canyon. The stars were bright, and the desert was quiet except for the occasional sound of wind moving through the rocks. Clara and Ethan sat together, discussing the next steps. They knew that their journey required careful planning, and they needed to be prepared for any challenges ahead. Clara shared her fears about what might happen if they made a mistake, and Ethan offered reassurance, reminding her of everything they had already accomplished together. It was a moment of trust and connection, one that strengthened their partnership even further. As days passed, Clara and Ethan encountered more signs of danger. Small groups of men who had once been loyal to the harmful leaders were still in the area, trying to regain control or intimidate settlers. Clara's knowledge and Ethan's courage allowed them to handle each situation carefully. Sometimes they would hide and observe, learning about their movements before taking action. Other times, they would confront them directly, using strategy and calm authority rather than force. Each encounter reinforced the lessons they had learned during the crisis. Patience, trust, and careful planning were more powerful than anger alone. During this time, Clara also reflected on her personal journey. She realized that her desire for revenge had been fueled by pain and loss, but it had also given her the strength to survive and protect others. She began to understand that true justice was not about causing harm. It was about creating a safe, fair environment where people could live without fear. Ethan's support helped her see that courage and compassion could coexist, and that together they could make a real difference. This realization gave Clara a sense of peace, even as they continued to face challenges. One day, while scouting a narrow ridge above a dry riverbed, Clara spotted movement below. A small group of men, likely scouts or followers of the leaders they had confronted, were approaching a nearby settlement. Clara signaled to Ethan, and they quickly devised a plan. Using the high ground, they were able to observe the group without being seen. They could anticipate the men's movements and warn the settlers in time. Clara and Ethan worked together seamlessly, using their skills and knowledge to prevent potential harm. When the settlers were safely alerted, the men below moved on, unaware that their plans had been foiled. This success strengthened Clara's belief in the importance of careful planning and strategic action. She and Ethan continued their journey, moving from one settlement to another, observing, warning, and protecting. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to grow and strengthen their partnership. They learned to rely on each other not only for survival, but for guidance, understanding, and support. Through shared experiences, laughter, and careful action, they became more than allies. They became a team united by purpose and mutual respect. One night, as they rested near a small spring, Clara and Ethan shared stories of their lives before the journey. Clara spoke of her childhood, the lessons her parents had taught her, and the dreams she had once held. Ethan shared stories of his own past, the hardships he had faced, and the hopes he carried for the future. These conversations allowed them to see each other as more than partners in a mission. They were people with histories, feelings, and dreams. Their trust deepened, and a quiet bond of friendship and understanding began to grow into something stronger. The turning point of their journey came unexpectedly. While observing a group of men from a distance, Clara realized that one of the leaders they had confronted was planning to return and reclaim control. This time, the threat was greater, and the risk of failure higher. Clara and Ethan knew they could not rely on luck. They had to act decisively, using everything they had learned. They studied the men's movements, anticipated their actions, and prepared a strategy that would ensure both safety and justice. It was a moment that required courage, intelligence, and complete trust in one another. When the confrontation came, Clara and Ethan were ready. They positioned themselves carefully, using the terrain to their advantage. The men were confident at first, believing they could regain control. But Clara's careful planning, combined with Ethan's quick thinking and support, allowed them to neutralize the threat without unnecessary violence. The leaders were forced to recognize the consequences of their actions, and the settlements were protected. Clara felt a sense of accomplishment, not from revenge, but from the knowledge that her actions had created safety, justice, and hope. Afterward, as they rested and reflected, Clara realized how much she had changed. Her desire for revenge had transformed into a sense of purpose. She understood that courage, wisdom, and careful action could achieve far more than anger alone. Ethan had also grown, learning the value of patience, observation, and teamwork. Their experiences together had strengthened their bond, and both knew that their journey had created something lasting, a partnership built on trust, respect, and shared determination. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky with shades of orange and red, Clara and Ethan sat together quietly. The challenges they faced had tested them in ways they had never imagined. They had survived the crisis, protected others, and learned important lessons about justice, trust, and courage. For Clara, the turning point was clear. Revenge was no longer the goal. It was justice, protection, and creating a future where people could live safely and freely. And Ethan understood that their partnership had become more than survival. It had become a bond that could face any challenge. The desert night settled around them, calm and quiet, but full of life. Clara and Ethan knew that the journey was not over, that there were still challenges ahead. But they were ready, stronger than before, and united in purpose. The lessons of courage, trust, and careful action would guide them forward. And as they looked up at the stars, both knew that they had reached a turning point in their journey, a moment that would define not only their mission, but the bond they shared and the future they were determined to protect together. The desert morning was quiet and still, the air filled with the soft sounds of the wind passing over the sand and the distant calls of birds. Clara and Ethan had traveled far since their first encounter, facing dangers, testing their courage, and learning the value of trust and teamwork. Now they stood at the final stage of their journey, knowing that the decisions they made today would shape the future, not only for themselves, but for the people who depended on them. Clara looked out over the land that had been both her home and the source of so much pain. Memories of her family, lost so many years ago, rose to the surface. She had felt anger, fear, and sorrow, but she also felt something new: hope. The journey had taught her that revenge alone could not bring peace, but courage, wisdom, and justice could. She turned to Ethan, who had been her companion and ally throughout the trials. His steady presence reminded her that she was not alone, and that together they could accomplish what neither could have done alone. Their first task that day was to ensure that all nearby settlements were protected. Clara and Ethan moved quickly, visiting each community, checking that defenses were in place, and offering guidance on how to stay safe. Some of the settlers were hesitant, unsure of what to expect, but Clara's calm authority and Ethan's practical advice reassured them. Together, they showed the importance of careful preparation, teaching the settlers that safety came not just from weapons or strength, but from observation, planning, and teamwork. By midday, they received news that one of the remaining men who had caused Clara's family so much harm was attempting to escape across the desert. Clara's pulse quickened, but she did not act impulsively. She reminded herself of all the lessons she had learned: patience, strategy, and trust in her own skills. Ethan stayed by her side, ready to follow her lead, knowing that rash action could make the situation worse. They prepared carefully, following the man's tracks across the sand, moving quietly and keeping hidden until the right moment to intervene. As they approached a narrow canyon, they spotted him from a distance. The man was alone, confident, and unaware of the careful tracking that had brought Clara and Ethan so close. Clara whispered her plan to Ethan, explaining how they could prevent his escape without causing unnecessary harm. She wanted justice, not violence for its own sake. Ethan nodded, understanding that this was the moment where skill, courage, and wisdom came together. They moved slowly, using the shadows of the rocks and the terrain to their advantage. The confrontation was tense. The man realized too late that he was cornered, and for the first time, fear appeared in his eyes. Clara stepped forward calmly but firmly, explaining that the time for reckoning had come. She spoke with clarity about the pain he had caused, the families he had harmed, and the responsibility he now had to face. Ethan remained close, ready to act if necessary, but trusting Clara to lead the interaction. The man listened, realizing that escape was impossible and that the consequences of his actions could not be avoided. Clara's calm strength and careful planning allowed the situation to end peacefully. The man was captured, not harmed unnecessarily, and he would be held accountable for his actions. The settlers and Apache people in the area were safe, and the threat that had haunted Clara's life for so long was finally removed. For Clara, it was a moment of profound relief, not from anger, but from knowing that justice had been done. Ethan smiled quietly, proud of Clara's courage and wisdom, and grateful for the journey they had shared together. With the danger behind them, Clara and Ethan had time to reflect on their journey. The desert around them was vast and empty, yet it had been the place where they had learned the most important lessons about trust, courage, and partnership. Clara realized that her desire for revenge had been replaced by a sense of responsibility and purpose. She had faced the men who had caused her family harm, but she had also protected others, shown wisdom, and used her skills for good. It was a new chapter in her life, one shaped not by anger but by justice and hope. Ethan also reflected on the journey. He had come to the desert as a young cowboy, skilled and brave, but he had learned much more than survival. He had learned the value of careful planning, observation, and patience. He had seen Clara's courage and wisdom, and he had grown to respect and admire her more with each passing day. Their journey had forged a bond between them, one built on trust, shared experiences, and mutual respect. Ethan realized that his life had changed forever, not just because of the adventure, but because of the connection he had with Clara. As the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Clara and Ethan found a quiet spot to rest. They sat together, looking out at the land that had shaped them, tested them, and now, finally, offered a sense of peace. Clara spoke softly about her hopes for the future, helping her people, supporting the settlements, and making sure that justice and safety were maintained in the land she loved. Ethan listened, offering his support and sharing his own hopes of building a life that honored their journey and the lessons they had learned. In that moment, Clara realized that her bond with Ethan had grown into something deeper than partnership. It was a connection forged in trust, courage, and shared purpose. She felt a sense of peace knowing that he would stand by her side, not just in danger, but in life. Ethan, looking at Clara, felt the same way. Their experiences had shown them both the strength of unity, the power of compassion, and the importance of acting with wisdom and courage. Together, they were ready to face whatever the future might bring. Over the following weeks, Clara and Ethan worked to ensure that peace was maintained. They taught settlers and Apache people alike how to protect themselves, how to anticipate danger, and how to act wisely when challenges arose. Clara's leadership, combined with Ethan's practical skills, made them a respected pair in the region. The settlers and Apache people began to see that coexistence, understanding, and cooperation were possible even after years of fear and tension. The land, once filled with danger and uncertainty, began to feel safer and more welcoming. Clara also took time to honor her family. She visited the places she had known as a child, remembering the lessons her parents had taught her and the love they had shared. Though the pain of loss remained, she found comfort in knowing that she had fulfilled her promise to protect her people and ensure justice. Ethan accompanied her, providing support and companionship. Their shared experiences made these moments of reflection more meaningful, showing them both how far they had come and how much they had grown. The final days of their journey were filled with small victories and moments of quiet happiness. Clara and Ethan strengthened the bonds between the communities, helping to create a network of support and cooperation. They celebrated small successes, a settlement fully prepared for safety, a group of settlers and Apache people learning to work together, and the knowledge that the threat of the men who had caused so much harm was gone. Each step reinforced the lessons they had learned and the importance of courage, trust, and wise action. Finally, one evening, as the desert sun dipped below the horizon, Clara and Ethan sat together, watching the stars appear in the sky. The journey that had begun with pain, anger, and the desire for revenge had transformed into a story of courage, partnership, and justice. Clara realized that she had found more than safety for her people. She had found a partner in life. Ethan realized that he had found more than adventure. He had found someone whose strength, wisdom, and courage matched his own. Together, they knew that they could face anything the future might hold. Clara turned to Ethan and spoke quietly. "We've done more than survive, Ethan. We've protected people, learned from each other, and created something stronger than either of us could have done alone." Ethan nodded, smiling, "And we'll continue together. Whatever comes next, we face it as a team." The bond between them was clear, a partnership built on shared trials, trust, and mutual respect. It was a bond that would guide them for the rest of their lives. In the days that followed, Clara and Ethan returned to the settlements to help establish lasting peace. The men who had caused harm were held accountable, and the communities were safer than they had been in years. Clara found satisfaction not in revenge, but in the knowledge that her actions had created a better future. Ethan felt pride in their accomplishments, knowing that their courage, wisdom, and teamwork had made a real difference. Together, they had turned a story of loss and pain into a story of hope, justice, and resilience. As the desert sun rose one morning, Clara and Ethan stood together, looking out at the horizon. The land was still wild and unpredictable, but it was also full of promise. Their journey had tested them in every way, physically, emotionally, and mentally. But it had also shown them the power of courage, trust, and partnership. They knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but they were ready. Together, they could face anything, protect those who needed help, and continue building a future based on justice and care. The story of Clara, the Apache woman who had survived loss, pain, and danger, and Ethan, the cowboy who had grown into a wise and loyal partner, reached its natural conclusion. Their journey had been long and difficult, but it had also been full of growth, learning, and connection. They had faced danger, crisis, and moral challenges, and had emerged stronger, wiser, and united. The desert, once a place of fear and loss, had become a symbol of their resilience, courage, and the enduring bond they shared. As the stars shone above them, Clara and Ethan knew that the journey of life was ongoing, but they faced it together, ready to protect, to support, and to build a future shaped not by anger, but by wisdom, courage, and the strength of their partnership. The trials of the past had taught them that true justice came from careful action, patience, and courage. And together, they had achieved not only justice, but also a bond that would last forever.